Hello, welcome to the 84th episode of From Alpha to Omega. This is going out on Google, on YouTube with live, so this will not have the usual intro music. I have with me today David Zachariah. David's a researcher in Uppsala University in Sweden, specializing in machine learning, but in his spare time, he also does a bit of political economy research. David, how did you find yourself working in this kind of stuff?
I guess it's a weird story. I must have randomly entered something on socialism on Google once and found a book by Paul Kotschodt and Alan Cottrell. It was about planning macroeconomic systems, essentially, how you build an egalitarian economy. And it contained a lot of math in the footnotes, at least to me at the time. I was in high school. And I decided to learn what is required to perform macroeconomic planning. So I'd learn about linear algebra and input-output tables, etc. And that caught my interest in all these debates around political economy, Marxian political economy, etc. So I sort of fell into it by accident, but I've stayed interested ever since.
Well, that's interesting because I did the opposite. I've done a degree in mathematics, and I'm actually reading that very book at the moment. So it's like I've done what you're doing in reverse.
Okay.
So you've done some of your work on your political economy stuff, some empirical research on Marxist political economy, through the kind of lens of statistical dynamics. Statistical mechanics, is that the correct term?
Yeah, that's probably the accurate term.
Yeah. So can you talk about the two men who kind of started this field, which sometimes is kind of nowadays called econophysics, but they don't tend to get the acclaim that some of the other econophysicists get. But these are the two people, Farjun and Machover.
Right. Yeah, so a bit about the background. Farjun and Machover are two Israeli origin mathematicians. They were heavily involved in the Israeli left, one of the early dissident groups to realize Israel was a settler colonial state. Somehow Farjun got involved in debates in political economy among Marxists and Sraffians, and realized their whole framework and their whole conception of the economy was in many ways flawed, or at least the way they formalized it. And inspired by their colleague Langston, they embarked on a complete reconstruction of how political economy should be done. And so they had a background, or they had knowledge about mathematical descriptions of statistical mechanics, and used some of the insights from statistical mechanics essentially as powerful analogies to develop something new.
Yep. So can you tell us what statistical mechanics is for the layman?
Right. So it's a way to look at large systems with a lot of degrees of freedom. It has, so the classical example is gas with gas contained in a closed container. So you got millions of different molecules bouncing around. So to describe this entire system requires to specify each molecule with its position and velocity. And that becomes, for sake of analysis, becomes essentially intractable and requires a lot of strange assumptions to say something detailed about the system. So instead, statistical mechanics says, okay, we can't say anything about individuals, but we can say something about the distribution of how the individuals behave. For instance, what's the average velocity of the molecules? And you can do that because even though there are lots of degrees of freedom, there are some overall constraints on how they can behave. There's only a certain amount of energy contained in this, which they can share. And so you're essentially viewing large-scale, uncoordinated systems with many degrees of freedom through the lens of distributions, statistical distributions, instead of individual descriptions.
So we see here a kind of a natural map to the world of economics, where we have our microeconomics and our macroeconomics.
Yeah, you could argue that. I think one of the beautiful things about it is that, unlike traditional microeconomics, statistical mechanics makes very few assumptions about these individual elements of the system. You don't have to assume much about, I mean, a molecule, whatever. There's no intent there. It just has very basic laws in which they collide and operate. There could be all kinds of circumstances when molecules are behaving in one way or the other. Sometimes they go up in velocity, sometimes down due to all kinds of local effects. But statistical mechanics essentially is agnostic to these things. It produces powerful predictions irrespective of the assumptions or very detailed assumptions. And so this is very different than microeconomics, which assumes very detailed assumptions about behavior of individual units, say firms or consumers or whatever.
So what were the key findings then of Macrover and Farchun's work?
Well, one of the initial motivations for what became their book was a way to view the question of profit and profit rates. A lot of political economy up to that point had assumed that in competition you will have capital moving from low profit to high profit sectors, and so you will have some sort of equalization of profitability across the economy. It may not. There's a soft version of that where there's just a tendency, but one of the common assumptions then is that therefore we can replace all the profit rates in this economy and just assume they're all equal and study the system from this hypothetical point of view, so its influence on prices, etc. They broke with all this and said essentially that we have to view profit rates as something that has a dispersion always. There will be equalizing tendencies and tendencies that pull profit rates apart. Churning of technological innovation, competition, etc., always pushes profit rates up and down. So what you can say is sort of stable maybe is a distribution of profit rates. So there's never the profit rate going up or down. There's always a multitude of profit rates contained in a distribution. That is one of their first conceptual breaks, articulating what the distribution of profit rates ought to be, its shape, and its main determinants. And that broke with the whole tradition up to that point. And then their second contribution in terms of the overall framework of the book is to start connecting the random or disorganized behavior of market economies to the classical labor theory of value that you find in classical political economy. So basically the theory that there's a real cost to reproducing goods and services. You can quantify that in labor time, and that this deterministic quantity will be related to the random fluctuating prices that you observe on the market. So here is the huge change also in viewing. There is not a price for, say, a pizza or a car, unlike the previous formalisms. There's always a multitude of prices, and you have to build a theory of how that interacts with labor value, essentially.
So how did they set up this? So how did they set up their system to get these kind of core predictions out of it? Like,
yeah. So with respect to the profit rate, they are more building analogies and arguing from that point of view. They didn't do it very stringently there. But if you look at the overall argument, it's like they started up by saying, okay, the profit rate, if you look at the economy, there are a multitude of profit rates. So that's the analogy to the gas molecules bouncing around with different velocities. You have firms with different rates of profit. That's the analogy of velocity. And some will be high and some will be low. Well, a few of them, when you take up the rate of profit, very few can sustain themselves long with a negative rate of profit. So the distribution should have very little mass or probability that is on the negative profit rate side. So that already constrains the distribution to being mostly positive or non-negative at least. And then they argue that there's essentially some overall macroeconomic constraints. There's only so much labor available. There's only so much implicitly state money available. There's over, let's say, a period of a month, there's only so much demand that these firms can win in their competition. This will be analogous to an energy constraint, is sort of how they argue. And then they go back to statistical mechanics and say, well, if you have such constraints on a system with many degrees of freedom, you typically get something like a gamma distribution. It's a certain of a skew shape. And that's what they postulate as a distribution for the profit rates. And you get distributions sort of of that type in the real world when you look at empirically.
So the empirical research has looked at, say, what countries over what time period, or what does it show? How close does it fit to the expected gamma distribution?
There has been more work by Ian Wright on the theoretical extensions of this, whether gamma is appropriate or not. But if you look at the work that I did on rates of profit, on flow rates of profit, was essentially most of the OECD countries, so the advanced capitalist countries, starting from around 1968 from the UK up to the 1990s and early 2000s. They all showed a huge or significant dispersion of profit rates. You always have a big variety of profit rates. And they tend to be skewed, all of them. So the empirical evidence for their initial prediction is the evidence pretty strong, I would say. But I would say that their gamma hypothesis is more questionable, and it was more of a working hypothesis than anything else.
So you mentioned some other research by, who did you say, Ian Wright?
Ian Wright, yeah.
Yeah, and what type of distribution did he propose?
He came up with a very complex one, but based on fundamental principles. It didn't end up as any of the standard distributions. But you get something, I think, closer to heavy tail distributions. I cannot remember now, but he has done some simulation work, agent-based modeling, where he reproduces what you find in many economies as well. I should say one thing about the way that Farjo and Macover view their distribution. It's not that they view the profit rates as a distribution over all firms, because then you get thousands of small firms that earn all kinds of profit rates. Instead, they view the distribution in terms of the capital stock invested in the economy. So if you have a big company, say Volvo in Sweden, that will take up a big share of the distribution because it's measured as a fraction of total capital invested. And so small firms will have little impact on this big distribution of capital invested.
Okay, fair enough. So what else? So can we get towards their work on dealing with the trying to show that the labor was basically the source of value and the determinant of price? Right.
So that was probably their initial motivation to write the book, because there was huge debates about the relevance of the labor theory of value. I guess I can get to that later. But the way they got to it was to accept that prices are random quantities from the point of view of the economy. Whenever you buy a cup of tea or whatever it is, it's dependent on so many factors that from the macroeconomic point of view, it's purely random. But random does not mean arbitrary. There are certain constraints. And essentially, that's what they tried to derive. And they derived it by saying, okay, let's look at every transaction that happens over, say, a month. Let's record what is the price of that transaction and the labor value of that, or the labor content of that good or service that was bought. And so it's basically a price to labor value ratio. And if that ratio is random, obviously, it'll have a distribution. If that distribution is very narrow, then most of the ratios are very similar. That means price tends to be quite proportional to labor value. And they set up without any they set it on fundamental principles. They could deduce that it should have a mean based on certain macroeconomic conditions, and dispersion based on the probability that you will not be able to meet the wage bill, essentially, when you in production. So they derive from first principles what the distribution of price to labor content should be, and set that out as a prediction. And then it was subsequently tested over the years. And so if we should boil down to something, they have essentially formulated a probabilistic or stochastic version of the labor theory of value, one that takes into account the fact that capitalist economies have are disordered, disorganized, and have never a single price for any good or service that's bought or sold.
But in the whole, we see a strong link.
Exactly. So that they deduced there should be a fairly narrow distribution of price to labor content, and so therefore there should be a fairly strong link between them, implying a correlation between them. And then subsequent studies made by Anwar Shaikh and many others, Paul Cockshott, and then later myself, show that over many countries, all the advanced countries, not all, most of the advanced countries, and over a significant period of time, you find a very strong correlation between the size of industry outputs in price and the size of industry output in labor. And this is all in line with the predictions that they had. And it's better than any prediction you can find for any other value that you could set up, steel value, whatever.
And so this is what's the correlation like? Did I see is like 93% correlation or something?
Yeah, it's interesting. So you get something close to what apparently David Ricardo predicted. You get the correlations, the correlation coefficient being something like 93, 95%, etc. So it's a very tight correlation, more or less what they predicted.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? Like, particularly when we think about, say, all the attacks that have come against, say, Marx's work. Primarily, they've always been on, well, they can't attack the empirical research because it lines up and stacks up. So they got to kind of attack it for its logical consistency, you know. So, and it's interesting that, you know, when we boil this down to, say, a statistical mechanics thing is like a rewriting of Marx's theory, but not from his own point of view, and it still pushes out the same predictions, and the empirical work backs it up. It's very strong.
Right. Well, I think it shows the strength of the original questions that these economists, including Marx, posed. So
yes,
I think it's a fruitful, viable research program that these questions generate. But then the tools have been developed since then, and why shouldn't we take the best tools available? It happens to come from partially statistical mechanics now.
You know, it's very interesting. So what other work have in this area has borne fruit?
Well, it's a bit strange that they essentially came up with something that's very close to what we today would call econophysics, but their work was largely ignored among Marxian economists. They couldn't understand it. Their publisher never promoted their book, so it fell into obscurity. But then, more or less, this sort of conception was reinvented later under the rubric of econophysics, with actual physicists working on it. And some of the more interesting related work has been done by, you probably know, Viktor Yakovenko, who has looked at income distributions from a similar point of view, where you have
I don't know this guy. So can you tell us about this research?
Okay, so I would say he did some path-breaking research. I think it was in the mid-90s, where he actually he took this sort of metaphor or analogy one step further. He says, okay, suppose in market exchange you have individuals who exchange goods, so therefore they exchange money. And so you can think of them as molecules that collide. if they exchange money, it's conserved. It's not being destroyed. It's just transferred from one to the other. Well, that's using the analogy of energy being transferred between two molecules that collide, but there's no loss of energy in the ideal gas. From that very simple idea of market agents that collide and adding a constraint that there's only a certain amount of money available as a sum for a fixed period of time, you get immediately a distribution of income across agents. You get something called the Boltzmann-Gibbs distribution. It's a form of exponential distribution. And so it tells you what fraction of the population will be in high income brackets and low income brackets by this very simple principle. I would argue oversimplistic, but just as a fruitful hypothesis, that's what the theory predicts. Then Yakovenko and his researchers went to the data sets and found exactly this distribution for about 97% of the population follow a Boltzmann-Gibbs distribution.
So this is the idea then that some people will do better out of these exchanges than others, but it's a closed kind of system essentially. It's just
exactly, yeah. I mean, from this random point of view, there will always be people on the top from pure market exchange from this simplistic point of view, and there will always be people on the bottom from market exchange. So
okay, so and the idea here is that like you might have, say, a trader like an antiques trader who really knows the right market price for these things and can buy them cheap and sell them high, and he'll do very well out of this kind of thing. But there will be losers on the opposite side.
Exactly.
But it's a kind of a closed system, and those 97% of people, their income at the end of, say, a random bouncing around for a year will be distributed in a certain way.
Exactly. And so it's amazing that this simplistic idea holds in empirically. Of course, the mechanisms in the real world probably is not the same, but those simple, powerful ideas can generate something testable and more accurate than any neoclassical theory can produce. Now, I should say a follow-up to that. There's a very interesting following research that Yakovenko did. So I told you that this distribution, the Boltzmann-Gibbs, holds for 97% of the population.
Tell us about the other 3%.
The other 3%. What's happened to them?
Yeah. Well, who are these guys?
It turns out this income group follows a completely different distribution, the Pareto law. So it's like a heavy tail distribution. It's closer to what you find in the distribution of earthquakes. And when you look at who are these people, essentially they are derived more or less from property income. So incomes derived from property follows a completely different law, statistical law, that is. It's one where Yakovenko argues it's because their incomes are multiplicative. You earn it as a percentage of your capital, for instance, whereas the other income groups are not earning in the same type. And so it's curious that essentially his research prefigures the Bernie Sanders slogan of the 99%. It's actually the 97%. And then you have a 3% that earns income in a different way. And Yakovenko says simply that this is a two-class system based on purely statistical arguments. And he calls one class basically the thermal class that follows like a thermal style distribution, and the other ones are a super thermal class. And following research by Anwar Shaikh showed essentially that the entire income inequality can be largely predicted from how big a share of national income comes from property. Once you know that fraction, you know quite well how big this super heavy income group is.
So this, when you say property, I presume you mean like lands that can have rent and shares that have dividends.
It's predominantly, it seems, shares, but I think Anwar Shaikh's work has shown even broader income sources. But the reason I say shares is that Yakovenko's first work showed that while the 97% income distribution is pretty stable over time, from the 90s up to the 2000s, the super income group fluctuates. Their distribution jumps up and down, and these jumps are more or less correlated with the stock market indices. So it seems like stocks, incomes from stocks are a big part of that.
That's very interesting. I think I've talked to somebody before, and he mentioned some of this research, but I wasn't aware of the guy's name. It's quite startling that, you know, simple models that have not very many preconditions set upon them can give such predictable, results. You know, empirically backed up results in the real world. When we think of how complex our system is, and it just shows you essentially how reducible it is.
Exactly. Yeah, that's some of the early research in statistical mechanics quipped essentially the same thing. I think it's cited in Fardian and McEvoy's book. Kinchin, who was one of the pioneers, he said it's almost as if we sort of deliberately make the system as we're so deliberately ignorant of the details of the system, yet produce such accurate predictions. So it was noted already by physicists that there's something to it when it comes to these large scale systems that are in many ways uncoordinated.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. Is there what does it say about the falling rate of profit? Is there anything coming out of the research on that?
Yeah, so they, in Fardian and Mako's book, they do devote some time to that in their ending chapters. So as I said, they had derived they postulated a distribution of profit rates, and of course there's an average then, or a mean expected profit rate, and that you can deduce what kind of constraints will be set on that profit rate. And they did it, and of course it becomes something very close to what Marx was doing. A ratio of living to dead labor, a fraction of labor that goes to surplus. And they argue that while there are tendencies to that could bring this profit rate down, there should be also equalizing tendencies that bring it up as well. What happened subsequently was that some initial work by Alan Cottrell and Paul Cockshott pushed me in the direction of actually trying to derive how will this profit rate behave, this average profit rate, and find the main determinants. And I did some work on that, and that became what we call the equilibrium profit rate. So it's essentially telling you where is the average profit rate going to be as a function of how efficient the economy is, how fast its labor force is growing, and how much profits is being reinvested. And curiously, the determinants of the profit rate is not dependent on how much or how big the wage share is. So in other words, if workers demand or manage to win 90% of the value added or 10% of the value added, it will not change the trajectory of the profit rate. It will inexorably push itself to a certain level set by this equilibrium rate. So the work of Fardian and McEvoy led to more interesting predictions about average profitability. How would it evolve over time? And those predictions were also then tested in some work that I did for the advanced economies with certain implications.
So let me ask you a few questions on that just to clarify it up. So you're saying that the rate of profit, the rate of share of value added, so basically the level of exploitation of the worker, won't change. Essentially, you're saying the direction of the profit rate.
Yeah. So what happens is that,
but maybe how steep or rapid it climbs or declines.
Right. So let me put it like this: if we could fix the productivity growth, if we could fix the growth of labor and the investments, then
the growth of labor being the total number of hours worked in the economy.
Exactly. If those were given, so to speak, the profit rate will converge to a fixed number no matter what. It doesn't matter that the workers are demanding more or less. So wage restraint will not save the day. So that's actually a political implication from the theory. That means under these technical conditions of production and availability of labor, that was the fundamental constraints of how profitability will evolve. And no matter how much the workforce is restraining its wage demands, it will not change the trajectory of the profit rate.
Okay, so the idea is that, but the rate of change would be changed.
Yeah.
If I'm saying that right, like how fast it will reach the bottom of this asymptotic curve or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Will be
Exactly.
quicker.
The rate of change can be modulated by wage demands, obviously.
So this begs the question then, is it always a decreasing rate?
And the answer is no. And I would put it like this. It's essentially a question of when capitalists reinvest profits into production, will it raise productivity or will productivity growth be high? And will the growth of labor be high? If the answer is yes, then the rate of profit will rise. The average rate of profit will rise.
So explain that.
So it's basically this equilibrium profit rate is like it's just a ratio of how fast productivity grows plus how fast the labor force grows, divided by effectively the reinvestment share. So reinvestments brings down the profit rate, and productivity and growth of labor brings up the profit rate.
Okay, so this is just essentially restating in a formula what Marx would say are the equalizing tendencies against the falling rate of profit.
Yes, but I think it's making it more precise. It's telling under what conditions more precisely will you have a rising and falling profit rate. And so there's no tendency for one or the other. It's given by other factors that are technological and, well, let's say, socio-demographic. Marx did not really say, I mean, he sort of more or less implied that there will always be a downward tendency and everything else is counter tendencies, but you could just flip around the argument and say the other thing around. It really depends on variables that are more external.
Did he not make cases for the general tendency of there will be a kind of a limit to productivity? I suppose productivity is the wrong word, but perhaps when you say productivity, we're not essentially saying, we're saying how intensively that worker can actually work.
Yeah,
as opposed to how productive the capital element is.
No,
the fixed capital.
I should say, yeah, it's the worker side. It's how efficient labor is becoming.
Yes, exactly.
So it's making Marx's statements much more precise. And what does it mean when living labor increases, etc.?
Yes. So when you say, just to be very clear here, for my own understanding, what we're saying is that the productivity of the worker, but we're not saying like the worker working at the same rate with a new machine is more productive, are we? Are we saying
yes.
that?
So if there's technical change, the productivity will rise. So the output per unit of labor will rise.
Yes. Okay. But we're not.
Yeah.
The intensity. Are we talking about intensity of labor?
Yeah, that intensity could be another aspect of raising productivity. Of course, you could squeeze out more work per hour from someone.
So that's still kind of unusual then. So we're saying if we keep the intensity of labor static.
Yeah.
So I think like what Marx would have said, forgive me if I'm wrong on this, but that there's only a limit to the intensity of you can get out of a person.
Absolutely.
And that will lead to a kind of limit to this productivity element.
Well, that's where Farjan and Macor clearly show that. Yeah, that is an incomplete argument. So yes, intensity you can only squeeze out so much from people until there's fatigue or loss of production. But productivity can be enhanced by, or the efficiency of labor can be enhanced by augmenting labor with new machines or different organization of production, etc., etc.
But that's interesting. It's interesting. Like I'm still kind of struggling to see how, if we keep intensity static at a constant level and we increase investment, one would have thought that then the ratio of labor to capital would be increasing, and thus the labor content of each element would decrease, or each product. and the profit rate would be under attack from that side. But you're saying that if they increase the investment, it can actually increase the profit rate at a systemic level.
Only so insofar that as you get more labor into the system, and or you get more efficient labor out of it. But the moment investments no longer give such yields, the profitability will decline. And so this ratio essentially predicts how will it go, which way will it go once you know these variables.
Okay, so the idea is like with your increased investment, you're able to apply more labor in the economy.
Exactly, that will be a factor that raises it. And then you can imagine what happens. So China, for instance, you'll have huge supplies of labor that can enter the industrial workforce from the agriculture, from the rural parts of the country. So that term will raise their profitability. But in countries where these sources are depleted, there will be no rise of labor. Essentially, the massive labor sources will be depleted. You cannot go beyond population growth. And so as an economy develops and industrializes, the effect of labor on profitability will vanish over time. And all that's left essentially is how much can investments enhance productivity. And you can see this, interestingly, this prediction for Japan and contrasted with other countries that have higher population growths, and see what is the effect of this labor growth term. And you can see in Japan it's zero because there is no population growth.
So what does some of your work had some predictive stuff about GDP growth rates? Is this what you're talking about here with the profit rate and how it impacts?
1 second, the connection is a bit poor. Can I reconnect?
Yeah.
1 second.
So Dave has hopped off there. I think he's going to join again in a minute. Hopefully you'll be able to hear a bit better.
A little bit better, yeah. It's like a package drop, so I don't know what's happening.
Okay, you back?
Yeah.
Cool. So does this tie into this profit rate, this what you called the what was the name for your special profit rate? It was the,
I think we called it the equilibrium dynamic
profit rate.
I don't know. Yeah, it has some name.
And is that is essentially okay. So that profit rate, does this tie into then what we can expect from GDP growth rates?
No, it's a bit different in that it's connected in that productivity obviously enters into GDP growth rate, but here the rate of reinvestment matters. And so you could, in principle, have in principle high growth and declining profitability up to a point at least. So they're not directly connected. Of course, over time, what happens is you could think of a transition in which a capitalist economy, to maintain profitability, will lower its reinvestment and find a new balance in which productivity is low, but reinvestment is low. And so the rate of profit is now maintained at some new stable level. What you find then is that the economy will no longer grow at this rapid rate. So the economy is becoming effectively more parasitic in that the surplus of the economy is no longer being reinvested, but consumed by the capitalist class.
And perhaps it's just like keeping it at it's not investing in essentially new technology, but just in keeping depreciation at bay.
Exactly, yeah. And the rest is going to luxury consumption.
Well, is there anything else that we haven't talked about, Dave? We've gone through quite a lot of stuff there. So this is interesting because I've done a lot of interviews with people about the falling rate of profit and a lot of stuff on the empirical research of it. And the tendency across a lot of these different countries we've seen is say from England, I think it was in the high 50% in the 1840s or something, down to I think maybe even negative in the 1970s. I think now it's around 10 or 11%. That it seems from what you're saying, do you think that it's do you think that it's a lack of understanding of the capitalist class on how to maintain profit rates? Because your research would kind of point to you could essentially manage it at any kind of level you would wish.
Well, yes and no. So you couldn't necessarily manage it at any level because those depends on technological factors. If you reinvest, how much will productivity be? Well, we don't know. It depends on the phase of technology, industrial production, electrification. These things all change this balance. So in that sense, no one can essentially say manage it. But that's one aspect of it. But again, so what are we trying to manage? Even if we try to, it's the average profit rate. No one can manage the average profit rate. Every capitalist manages a bunch of firms which have all different profit rates competing with other ones, and everyone's trying to stay on top of the other. So you get a constant scrambling of profit rates, and there's no macroeconomic coordination in that sense. So it's out of that intermarket competition, looking for new technological opportunities, that you get new balances of the average profit rate. And so if the average profit rate goes up and down, there could still be a lot of firms earning huge profit rates and same time low profit rates.
That's very good. But let's say, for example, we have another actor, like say the state. Could the state manage investment of research and development and stuff? Not exactly, but maintaining certain levels of investment, could that have and so increasing the, say, technological state of the businesses in their country, could that be managed? Could that be managed better by capitalist states to try and approximate levels for the most important determinants of this profit rate?
Yeah, I think so, and that would require industrial planning. And I think post-war Europe and Japan shows such attempts to actually modernize the economy. At one hand, keeping capital owners happy; on the other hand, developing state capacities and overall growth. So I think that attempt to modernize the capitalist economies after World War II is such an attempt. It may not be targeting average profit rates, but certainly is trying to make sure that the business confidence was healthy. Yeah, so I would say that. Maybe I should say, and I mean, related to that, the evidence for the United States, at least, is not, and that's the longest time series I've seen since about the Civil War. There is no evidence that the profit rates were once upon a time very high, and then there was like a progressive decline to what is today. Rather, you see something closer to the long waves of Kondratev. You see periods, I think, after the Civil War where it's high, it goes down to the Depression, and then things restart. And many time series start after World War II, and that's why it looks like the profit rate's always declining. But it's actually just another wave. And if once you have that perspective, this inexorable decline of the profit rate is a bit is an overstatement. You really have to look at wider factors.
So that's interesting. So, like, I think I've seen quite a bit of research. There's an Argentinian guy called, oh my God, his name has slipped me now. I'll put it in the show notes. But he's done ones for like, I think at least 15 different countries over, I think, like the last 100 years, and they pretty much all tend to follow the same rate in the same direction. And he's done a world level of an amalgamated one as well, which tends to. But what you're trying to say is that essentially the conditions have changed of those main determinants of your underlying. Sorry, I keep forgetting the name you had for your profit rate.
I think it's equilibrium rate.
The equilibrium profit rate, yeah. So that well, I suppose Marx himself says that, like, in his stuff on the falling rate of profit, that it's a tendency and it can be bashed up and down just as well.
Exactly, yeah. I think we would, I mean, as a research program, it will be clear to ourselves, we don't say as a tendency to fall, but really ask ourselves, what are the main determinants? and under what historical phases does it actually push down no matter what? And that's quite interesting. After World War II, you have a clear tendency downwards. And it's not clear exactly what are the conditions, but it seems like the particular production technology set that was around the time, with mass scale production, industrial production, that has sort of reinvestment there no longer gives those productivity gains anymore. And therefore you see this long-term decline. But you can imagine if the capital stock was partially destroyed and rebuilt again, you could reset some of those variables. And that's arguably what happened after World War II.
Very good. I'm just looking here to try and see that the Mackover book seems to be out of print and not even available secondhand on Amazon, as far as I can see. This is the one that's called The Laws of Chaos.
Yeah, it's a strange title, but yeah, that's it. It was, I think, New Left Books or Verso published it in 1983.
Yeah, and it's unusual that it doesn't exist. I'm presuming there's a PDF of it somewhere.
There is a PDF. Yeah, I have.
Is that how you read it?
No, I actually managed to get one of the few Amazon copies, and then when I met Mackover, he signed it. It was a rarity. So, incidentally, the book is published the same year I'm born. So,
very rock star. Very rock star. No, it's I hate reading books in PDF. I've been doing it a lot lately, and I despise it. But it's kind of hard in your eyes. So that's great. Is there anything else that we haven't talked about? We've talked about a lot of stuff.
Well, it's not directly related. I mean, I guess you have had other podcasts about it, but one thing is about clarifying about the labor value, how you can, I don't know if you discussed it as a labor value as a field property.
Okay, yeah, far ahead.
But anyway, it's just something I noted down. In that it's been taken for granted what I think the layman understanding of what labor value is as a property of a commodity, a reproducible commodity. But I think once you look at it from a mathematical point of view and formalize it that way, it's easier to see it as something like a property of a field. And the metaphor here, or the physical analogy, would be something like the Ian Wright, for instance, has pointed out. If you think of an object with mass, it's weightless if there's no gravity around. So if you have a gravitational field, you get a property. It gives a property to the object. And so the analogy with labor values is that reproducible goods and services, they have no labor value unless they're in a field, and this field happens to be the field of social production. And you can actually formalize it when you write out the labor values, and it looks like actually a vector field that you integrate over, and you get a bunch of labor values in that sense. And so you can actually view labor values as a field property, or a property of a field, when it comes to the goods and services in the economy.
That's pretty interesting. Like, forgive me if I'm misunderstanding this, but Marx would say that things only have value because of the setup of the society in a in a capitalist form. Say, well, not necessarily just a capitalist form, but they only have value because they're in a certain context.
Exactly.
So, if I build a table in my house, and we're living in I'm a peasant in the middle of nowhere or something, it has essentially no value as a commodity. It's just its use value to me, and it's the field of exchange and capitalist relations that actually assign the value to that object that I've expanded my labor on.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's precisely what I was trying to say, and that there's now a sort of more formal mathematical side to this argument, which is quite.
And does it throw out anything interesting, or it's just kind of mathematically formalizes the language?
I wouldn't say necessarily. I haven't thought through whether it actually produces some new predictions, but it just helps us articulate more clearly what value really is as in terms of a field property. And you can sort of argue that it's not necessarily exchange as such that does it. It's the fact that you have an economy based on a division of labor where no unit of production can reproduce itself on the one hand, and where labor can be redeployed across the economy. Then you have a scalar quantity that is universal in a sense. You need not speak of carpenter labor, whatever specific painting labor. You can speak of labor in general. And so the moment you can have redeployable labor, it's easy to set up this field, and then you get this potential property for goods and services. And then it's a question of whether these property has any empirical consequences. And we argue, yes, it has.
Well, no, it's very interesting. It's like the well, I think David Hilbert, mathematician, applied to Marx. That's kind of you're just formalizing all those words.
I haven't seen many papers on this specifics, but I'm thinking of writing it up together with Ian. We'll see how it unfolds.
You'll have to put me in touch with this Ian guy, and I'll have to try and read some stuff.
He has done some amazing work. I think since Farage and McElroy, I think he has done some of the most interesting, not necessarily empirical work, but theoretical or computational work in terms of agent-based modeling. So from very basic principles, can you reproduce features that you see in a capitalist economy, assuming almost nothing about individuals? And he has this fantastic paper in, I think, Physica A about the social architecture of capitalism, which is, I think, a must-read for anyone interested in political economy.
Yeah, that's very interesting, because I've often, I've thought myself about, like, I would always love to have kind of formalized Marx's work into an agent-based model and see what it would look like. I'm glad to see someone has done it.
Someone has done it, yeah. And it's absolutely spectacular. Even though it's very simplistic, doesn't assume much, it produces so many features that we know, the division of classes, the typical rates of unemployment, the growth, the size of firms, etc. I mean, numerous features are reproduced in a very simple agent-based economy.
Very interesting. Well, thanks very much, Dave, for coming on the show today.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for having me.
I'll just kick us off air now. Wait, now, how do I stop broadcasting?